all those who are watching, welcome. Our session today will be on governance in rural contexts, concepts, and challenges. And our presenter today are Dr. Brandon O'Caffey, David Douglas, and Dr. Francesco Navarro. Dr. Brandon is the co-director of the Gacera Institute of Action Research, an independent consultancy working in the fields of social research and local and community development. He was a senior lecturer in human geography and director of quality in Mary Immaculate College, University of Limerick, Ireland. His research area includes local development, governance, cross-border collaboration, and demographics. Dr. Brandon also has considerable practitioner experience in rural and community development. Today we also have David Douglas here with us, and he is a professor at the University of Guelph. He has been a researcher, writer, teacher, trainer, facilitator, and consultant and advisor in rural development for several decades in many Canadian regions, the EU, and several other international contexts. His most recent published work has been in rural community resilience, rural governance, and regional development. And lastly but not least, we have Dr. Francesco Navarro. He is an associate professor at the University of Granada Human Geography Department in Spain. Dr. Navarro develops his research in the analysis of the practice of neo and endogenous rural development. His expertise in local evaluation research on rural policies, especially impacts of the leader approach, social and territorial inequalities in rural development programs, and social innovation in rural development practices, among other research topics. Dr. Navarro has been involved with several collaborations with local action groups. I am now going to pass it on to our first presenter, Mr. David Douglas.
Thank you very much, Muzaline, and welcome to all participants. Delighted to have this opportunity to present with you. So very briefly, the agenda we're working with today, I'll just step through it, but it doesn't need much explanation. We'll have a brief recapitulation of governance, what we understand by this concept, because it is a contested concept, and it's really only with us for a couple of decades, from Stoker and Welsh and other sources. And then we'll place the question of governance in the context of rural settings, and to deal particularly with rurality. What are the salient characteristics of being in a rural setting, and how does this affect our approaches to rural governance? I'll then go through a suggested conceptual framework on rural governance without too much elaboration, and then we'll break for some questions for clarification. Following that questions, we will have two combined case studies from Ireland, and then we will have a more lengthy, hopefully lengthy discussion on those two case studies and their connections to the conceptual framework. And then we'll have another case study dealing with a Spanish context. And again, we'll follow that by hopefully some open and fruitful discussion on that. So that's essentially our agenda for today. The concept of governance, I've tried to put as compressed version I could here for all concerned, and it touches on the fact that in governance, unlike in government, we make a distinction between the process through which rural and local communities and areas try to develop a way to co-construct their future. And they do this by negotiating a multi-stakeholder process. They try to develop a collaborative system of decision design and decision making. And what is going on here is that instead of a top-down government only, it's a process of designing a degree of self-governing. And the resources are pooled, power is pooled through the collaborators, and the local communities and rural interests try to identify sufficient common cause. And the common cause is the glue that keeps them working together. And by identifying the common cause, there's a pragmatic understanding, and I emphasize the term pragmatic understanding, that if the communities are to achieve the requisite capacity, and particularly if they are to achieve a degree of agency, in other words, to be able to get things done, they need an appropriate institutional and organizational arrangements that are beyond the usual architecture, the conventional architecture of power, control, and authority, especially that which we associate with central governments, whether they're national governments, regional governments, state governments, or whatever it might be. So this is a co-constructed device. It's a co-constructed way of doing things together. So in governance, we question the role, the need for government as normally understood, formal government. And if we raise the possibility that, yes, government might play a role, but it may not lead. It may not steer the entire venture. It might be a co-collaborator. It might be a resource, a source, or whatever it might be, but it's not necessarily the driver of the entire venture. And what happens in governance is that we make up flexible, contextually appropriate organizations. So there's literally organizational design, often, if not usually, through networks with fuzzy boundaries and perhaps initially uncertain constructions, but we make up organizations that are designed to respond to the problems and the opportunities at hand. So we don't just take organizations off the shelf. We design them and we co-design them locally. And in this designing, we pool resources, we pool power, so there's a horizontal sharing of power and recognition of the need to share resources so that we can move towards agency. And because we literally construct this appropriate organization, inevitably there are challenges about its transparency, about its accountability, and indeed about its legitimacy. Because government has its own legitimacy, it's a statutory, it has a statutory presence, it has acts, it has funds, it has a history, a long history of being present, and of course it has enormous powers. In establishing our own local organizations, we have to respond to these challenges of legitimacy. And governance, of course, is about a plurality of interests. And they may not always be on the same page at the same time, but we hope with the identification and the sharing of understandings around sufficient common cause that we can develop the glue to hold the organization together and to design a development trajectory. So what we're doing here is developing what we call instrumental legitimacy. And the organization is legitimate because it's a participatory process and because we associate with each other because we want to, not because we have to, but because we want to, we develop what we call associative leverage. And the trick here, the challenge before rural communities, is to develop power together, to develop power with each other so that we can get power to do certain things. That's the centrality of agency. And because we're talking about governance in rural contexts, it's not just anywhere. It's not Madrid, it's not Budapest, it's not Ottawa, it's not Dublin, it's not London. It's in rural places that have particular rural particularities. Usually they're small, very often they're distant and they're remote. And what is a fact of life of rural places is that they're small, they're very often characterized by low densities and by distance from power sources, distance from markets, distance from major corporate centers, distance from the centers of decision-making and influence, and so on. So they are distant and they have low densities in every respect. not just in terms of markets and populations and so on. They've low densities in infrastructure, they've low densities in institutions, and so on. So they are very particular places, and we're very conscious of the imperative of placement with characteristics and distinctive assets. Now, we look at conceptual frameworks, not just because they might be academically elegant or we need them, but because we are very interested in understanding the principal components in a governance system. What are they? What are the principal components that are active in a rural governance system? And what's the nature of their complex cross currents? How do they interact with each other? And we're interested in these things because we know that cycles of devitalization in rural communities and rural areas, they work their way through pathways of influence and what we call relational networks. And if the networks break down, if the relations decline in their vitality and then the connections, we head into sort of cycles of devitalization. If we understand the wiring or the connections between the components of governance, then we can use those wirings, we can use those interrelationships to move towards more positive, virtuous cycles of development. So we want to understand what are the components in a rural governance system and how are they related. And this is one configuration that is suggested here, that we have in the upper piece of this, we have L and CD, in other words, localism and community-based development. That's where the leadership and the culture and the nature of the community itself is a significant factor. And then we have to its right, rural restructuring. We have the contested nature of rural places and spaces that are open to the lower right, to forces of globalization and capital movements, negotiation, influence, leverage, trade arrangements, political movements, movements in territoriality, and so on. And this takes us over to the whole question of governance itself. And we know that governance itself is an evolving concept and it's an evolving practice, and we're learning through its evolution itself. And then in the upper left hand, we have local government. And local government has gone through cycles of restructuring, so-called reform, and upscaling in the last 10, 20, 30 or more years. So these proposed components in a rural governance system interact with each other through complex pathways of interaction and influence. So that's the proposed framework of looking at rural governance system. Governance itself, the processes of rural restructuring, the influence of open-ended globalization, the changing nature of local government, devolution, decentralization, deconcentration, the restructuring of local government that continues apace in almost every country around the world and is influencing the fortunes of rural communities, and then localism and community development itself. So these are the proposed elements or subcomponents of rural governance, and we will use these as something of a reference system to look at the case studies. Okay, at this point, I'll hand over to Brendan O'Keefe.
So I'm going to take your conceptual framework forward, David, and I'm going to apply it to an example here in the Irish context, which has resonances throughout Europe as well, which is the leader model. And here on the first screen, I have listed what are called the specific features of leader. They're there on the right-hand side. These are the 6 components, and a lot of these resonate with the framework that you presented. Over on the left-hand side, I want to remind us of the objectives of leader, because very often when we look at material about leader, we see it presented to us as a program, and indeed it is. And programs have budgets, they have targets, and they enable projects to happen. But it's always important to look at the objectives, and you see there isn't any mention of program. We see an approach, a way of doing development, a methodology that reflects a lot of what you talked about, David. You talked about co-construction, you talk about collaboration, you talked about the pooling of power. And when we look at leader in that context, we use the term partnership, a partnership approach to decision making. And if you look then at the specific features on the right-hand side, the area-based approach, the idea of being localized, bottom-up development involving the local citizens being the main drivers, partnership, innovation, doing things differently, not doing things the way government did them or the way things were done in the past. The need to be able to experiment, to have flexibility, the need to work across different sectors, not just agriculture, not just economy, not just community, but the whole suite of those. And then networking and collaboration between different territories and within territories as well. And that can be a challenge, and that's where governance is important. So those are the specific features of LEADER. They've been in place since LEADER was conceived in the early 90s. And I now have on the next screen there a definition of community-led local development, which is in many respects a modernization or an update or a refresh of the LEADER-specific features. And this is meant to guide European cohesion policy in the current programme period. And you can see there it mentions the sub-regional areas, the emphasis on the local, being community-led. And it puts local action groups, which are the leader delivery organisations, front and centre. And they're to include public sector, but also the private and community. We talk about the area-based development, the local, the territorial, being strategic, looking at needs, but also looking at potential, not putting glass ceilings on rural areas or saying just because they're distant that they don't have the same potential as rural areas, and that requires innovation. And in Ireland, we have considerable experience over the last 30 years through the LEADER model and through our experiences of collaborative governance at local level. On the first map there on the left-hand side, you can see the 17 LEADER local action groups that pertained up to the mid-90s. Then by the mid to late 90s and right throughout the 2000s, we had full national coverage outside of the major cities. So LEADER was deemed to have been successful, and it grew to cover the country. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the reconfigured geography of LEADER, whereby LEADER has become more aligned with the boundaries of local government. Even though local government boundaries are historical, they're there since almost the late Middle Ages, and they're associated with the colonial regime rather than with the dynamics of modern functional areas. So there was an opportunity missed there. But also what's behind that map is an alignment of the functions and a rolling back on some of the collaborative governance or the pooled power or the community-led approaches that I had spoken to you about. So we now see local government, or should I say more accurately, local administration, much more in the driving seat. And the local action groups that are now called implementing partners and are subservient to local government. And that has slowed down the system and has moved us to a uniform approach right throughout the country. So we're not getting the nuances in terms of geography that we should if we were to be true to the LEADER specificities and to the community development approach. Now I'm going to look at an example of a LEADER area and a LEADER structure, and one that we have here in front of us is Carlow County Development Partnership. And in David's intervention, he talked about governance could be with or without government. Now, in the Irish LEADER model, it's always been with government. So that's why in the bottom right-hand side there, you see statutory. The statutory bodies being represented on the board of directors. But at the very top, you can see in the Carlow model, you have civil society, the community and voluntary organisations, environment, And then you can see community and voluntary organizations, and then specific communities of interest that in the past might not have been represented in your traditional governance models, the ethnicity, older people, and other constituencies who now have a seat at the table, who now are having their voice heard, who are exercising a degree of power from the bottom up. And then on the bottom left, you see the social partners, the productive sector, and obviously the agricultural interests and other local enterprises are to the fore there. So we have this tripartite model at local level. And in Ireland, we used to have tripartite models at national level, and they still do in many European countries, where you have this national social partnership, and now we have local social partnership being given effect through the leader model. And Carlow County Development Partnership itself, it associates the functions around governance with the board and the board of directors. And you can see there the emphasis on the board looking at long-term strategy, supporting and monitoring the work of the partnership, being strategic, and also promoting compliance with the governance code. The governance code is a framework for community and voluntary organisations in Ireland. So the responsibility for compliance there is with the board. It's interesting when you look at that quotation, it doesn't say anything about programme delivery. It puts the board at a much higher level beyond programme, looking at things more strategically, being more long-term. And then this is the structure that's in place to enable that to happen. And again, in its own documentation, Carlow talks about a 4-tier system where you have the board of directors, then you have the subcommittees, and there's an overlap obviously between those. So the support subcommittees report into the board. And then you have the interfaces indicated in the blue arrows between the board of directors, the chief and the chief executive officer, and the chief executive officer then being a member of the senior management team. And then you have program managers and so on there. Over on the right-hand side, I've listed there the various subcommittees that report to the board. The audit, strategic planning, and grant evaluation, they're the core, and they are very significant for the delivery of programs, particularly the LEADER program, and the evaluation of project applications is core business. And then we have others that are more strategic, more thematic, labour market, social inclusion, and rural development. And then governance is also about feedback, and we see here ways in which the partnership closes the feedback loops through its annual reports, its reports on various programs, and you can see their governance features in those reporting back. So we have a model, we have an organisation that has a lot of experience, and in my preparations for today I had a workshop with the directors, and I asked them to reflect on the specific features and what they do. So how does governance actually play out in practice? And we can see here the positives, the proximity to local people, to local citizens, to local communities. One quotation there, we are people-centred. They also talked to me about being focused on the rural, that so many of government and so many of the top-down organisations are focused on the urban, and we see that in the national planning framework and so on. So there's a need to focus on the rural. So they're filling a very important void and providing a very important service in that respect. And our conversations focused a lot on projects and the delivery and the development of projects and investing in projects. And then the participants also spoke about delivering program and the targets they have around that. But they find that the programs are increasingly top-down. We don't find what David was talking about initially about co-design. We don't see the leader groups having as much say as they should in shaping the programs that they then subsequently go on to deliver. So a sense among the participants or among the directors that the programs are increasingly prescriptive. And the need then to bring a bottom-up emphasis, bringing the experience of the bottom-up and the lessons from the bottom-up to bear on the programs. And a frustration to some extent at the level of the board that so much time is devoted to project evaluation and appraisal and not to the higher order business of governance, and a sense that we need to go back and to revisit the leader specificities and look at their relevance in 2019 and beyond, because they are indeed relevant to meeting the challenges and delivering the potential of rural areas. So notwithstanding those challenges, and David mentioned them as well, we have here in this 2 case studies in terms of what people are doing. And I find, looking at the leader organizations now, they're going beyond the scope of leader, and they're looking at other ways in which they can add value to their territory. And in the literature, we see about delivery, coordination, brokerage, and an emphasis on enhanced decision making. So on the right-hand side there, you can see that Carlow County Development Partnership is involved in a lot of research. And some of its research I'm involved with, and that feeds in not just to its own decision-making, but decision-making in other organisations as well. And were the partnership not doing that research, I wonder who would be doing it. And then on the left-hand side, we see Kilkenny, which is the adjoining Leader Local Action Group area, moving into the whole area of energy and sustainability. And again, that's going beyond the programme. The map, which is a cross-border, David, you talked about the fuzzy borders. We have the Nore River, its catchment area extending into Tipperary, extending into Laois. Those are adjoining counties. And then we have a congruence around the Nore Vision, which involves, again, multiple stakeholders. And that shows the dynamism of leader and the ability of leader to attract the various stakeholders and to do that flexibility. So we find now organizations that have been on the receiving end of so much from the top down, and they've had to withstand a lot. And we see the innovation, that spark is still very much there. And we need to continue to push that. So I'll take questions on the Irish model.
Alrighty, thank you, Mr. David and Dr. Brandon, for your great presentation. Before we start, before we move on to our next presentation, I have an open floor to any questions or discussions you guys want to do with David and Dr. Brandon. I did have one question pop up during the presentation. So one question was for Dr. Brandon. Can you please explain what leader is?
Okay. Leader is a program, in one sense, for rural development. It is funded through the Common Agriculture Policy, a second pillar therein, co-funded then by national governments right throughout the European Union member states. But I deliberately didn't talk about that strand today because I wanted to talk about leader as a methodology, as an approach, as a way of doing governance. I wanted to look at the concepts that David outlined to us at the beginning and just see how those are playing out in practice. So yes, leader is a program. It applies right throughout the European Union territory, and it applies in Canada as well, in Quebec. But today I want to focus on the doing and the way in which the local action groups operate. So the program is not delivered, it's co-financed by national governments and their governments, and they're the managing authorities, but it's delivered locally. And that's why I presented the maps of the areas in which leader is delivered through structures like the County Development Partnership that in the Carlow case study, that tripartite model.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Brandon. Another question is, governance can exist without a government. Can the first or second speaker explain this? And particularly, how is government conceptualized in this statement?
Perhaps I could, can you hear me okay? Hello?
Yep.
Okay, perhaps I can start a response to this. Government is, in governance, the idea of making a choice as to the role of formal government is part of the thinking, the initial thinking around the concept of governance. And governing, the verb governing has to take place, of course. People have to make decisions. Decisions have to be agreed upon, and the decisions have to be applied, and resources have to be allocated following those decisions. So governing has to take place. The old style of what some people have referred to as top-down development was government-led, and it was largely government-designed and government-driven. So we've seen regional development planning, we've seen regional economic planning, we've seen sectoral economic planning and other types of planning as being done by governments, central governments, provincial governments, state governments, and so on. And that's been fairly typical since really the middle of the 20th century. What has emerged from the imperative or the democratic need to have a local say in communities' development priorities, in communities' own cultures and their own development agendas, and so on. We've seen an emergence from localism and from locally based development that we need a more bottom-up understanding of what development is, what development priorities are, and rural communities and rural interests have been pressing for a greater say in their own futures. And this has led perhaps something to a meeting of the bottom-up and the top-down, somewhere in a sort of a middle-level area, a meso level of decision design and decision taking. And in that middle area, formal governments can play a collaborative role, a partnership role, a co-resourcing role, and so on. But they don't have to set the full agenda. They don't have to set the rules and the regulations and steer the entire development agenda. That's the option that's available to us when we talk about governance. So I hope that responds to that question, but I can elaborate further on that if anybody needs further input. Brendan or Francisco?
Yeah, there is a value in collaborative governance. There's a value in terms of the sustainability of rural territories. There's a value in terms of promoting what's called summative growth, where growth is engendered right across geographies, and that it's the sum of those parts then that contributes to well-being, to output, to quality of life collectively. So, there's a value in doing things this way. It's slower, it's a bit messier, it takes a bit more of an effort, but it offers the advantage of drawing on the strengths of the various contributors, because there are things that community and voluntary groups do very well. They get people on board. They reach out to hard to reach groups. Like sometimes youth will not engage with the state, but they will engage with the local community. The same might be said for members of ethnic minorities. There are groups who might not engage with the formal education system, but will engage with community-led education. So community and voluntary groups have something very valuable to bring to the table. The state sector, government, has something valuable to bring to the table. Funding, of course, but also particular technical know-how, skills, particular abilities in that respect. The productive sector, private enterprise, has something to bring to the table in terms of efficiencies, in terms of the way of doing business. The trade unions have things to bring to the table, farm organizations. So it's about getting the most out of all of those in that meso space that David talked about. And the good, the deliverable, the benefits in terms of rural development are more sustainable territories. But there's also another benefit associated with governance, and that is stronger democracy. Because this way of doing decision-making is also referred to as direct democracy or participative democracy. And we have seen the data that show that in areas where you have strong direct strong participative democracy, strong civil society, is people engaging with local decision making, where you have governance operating, that you also have stronger participative democracy, you have stronger democratic institutions, and you don't get then things like Brexit and Trump and all the rest of it, where we see the breakdown of social capital leading to a weakening of democracy, so that there's a democratic argument for the investment in governance as well as the investment in rural territories for the benefit of all.
Thank you. We have another question. So the question is it inevitable fact of life that governments and state bodies will seek to constrain and minimize the autonomy of community-led organizations?
That sounds like an Irish question, because leader here has been so dynamic, has such potential, but has been hammered by legislation and hammered by regulation, particularly over the last 10 years. It's not inevitable. Now, there is a school of thought, and we have Bourdieu and political scientists who tell us, the state is always sending its tentacles out into people's lives. But we also have at the same time the neoliberal state, the state withdrawing from public service provision and the state simply facilitating the market, going back to the laissez-faire economics of the middle of the 19th century. And that has affected the context in which leader is operating. So it's what's happening to leader and what's happening in rural communities is also happening and is very clearly manifest in deprived, disadvantaged, and I don't like using those terminologies, urban neighbourhoods as well, where certain cohort of citizens are becoming much more disengaged. In Britain, they talk about the underclass, which is a horrible term as well to be using. But, this disconnect between government and the governed is certainly one that's worrying. And I think that we could be caught up in, looking at programs and regulations and negotiations around what leader can and cannot do, when what we really need to do is focus on the bigger, wider agenda of the role of the state and the state being an enabler of development rather than a regulator.
Yes, leaders, let me say another sentence, please. Leader is operating under the umbrella of endogenous rural development and try to complement the governance in one hand and on the other hand, the government. Try to complement at the same time top-down and bottom-up approaches and local and external assets. It's not based in the confrontation of top-down approach and bottom-up approach. It tries to combine, to complement this relationship, these ways to make rural development, in my kind of opinion.
Thank you. Next question is, how would you respond in an area that is largely populated by non-residents cottage owners?
Let me at least start the response to that, as I've had some experience, especially in the Canadian, but also in other contexts. Cottage owners, like other sort of seasonal dwellers, seasonal residents, have to be seen as people with an interest in an area. They have a stake in the area. They've got private investments. They've got family investments. Many of them will have family memories and other affective capital, social capital, and the like associated with the area. So in rural development, they are, I think, as Brendan has been emphasizing, they are a part of the plurality of interests. They do have legitimate interests in the development of the area. They've got interests in the ecological systems and the quality of the biophysical environment. And they have a variety of other interests and priorities around infrastructure and so on. So in rural development, taking a holistic approach to rural development and looking at the social systems that are operating, I think we have to see seasonal dwellers, seasonal interests as part of the plurality of interests who have to be involved in the conversation around rural development and in the co-construction of the development agenda.
Thank you. Next question is, could the first speaker explain a little bit more about the concept of associative leverage and give an example of how this works or an example in which this can be observed?
Okay, very briefly, the associative leverage is, in a way, could be seen as a type of social capital. We think about bonding and bridging social capital in governance, where we associate with each other. Brendan touched on a number of interests. There might be micro enterprises, there might be small business groups, there might be agri-tourism groups, but there might also be conservation groups. There might be heritage organizations in an area, and they find common cause in the well-being and the security of the common territory. They want the very best for the environment, for the heritage artifacts, for the sacred sites, for the culture of the area. And in finding overlaps in their various interests, they develop an association, and they may not have associated before. If central government was designing and running the development agenda, we might never see these people at the table. We might never see the historical society, the fishermen's group, the women's organization, the youth recreation group, and so on. We might never see them at the table. In governance, we draw in this plurality of interests, and we look at the areas of overlapping common cause. And because they start associating with each other, they want to work together. They develop trust, and trust is a central issue here. They develop trust as a relational capital, and they're able to leverage this trust. So the historical organization, the conservation group are able to go back to their constituency and say, look, we're working with 8 other organizations, and we've never done this before. And we're going to have work done on the quality of the river banks. We're going to have work done on the reforestation project. We're going to have work done on the tourism-based micro-enterprises, or whatever the common cause is. So they're able to go back there to their constituencies, and they're able to say, we've got 6 other groups working with us, we've got 10 other groups working with us, or whatever it is. And the solidarity, this is a community development concept, the solidarity and the common agency that they're developing, that is leverage. They're able to get more out of that than they could have if they were just on their own. That's what the leverage is about.
Thank you, David. Another question is from Jill. Her question is, co-construction is an excellent objective for governance, but often this objective is marred in process. What best to marry existing frameworks to inform local governance models?
Leader, we invest in projects and we invest in outputs and deliverables that I've mentioned, but we also invest in what are called animation and capacity building, where you invest in the human capital, the social capital, the cultural capital, organizational development, and so on. And yes, Leader has really strengthened civil society in that respect. But my observation is that civil society now knows a lot more about co-design and co-decision making and power sharing than the statutory sector does in many respects, and that we actually now need to look at some pre-development work and some capacity building work with the statutory bodies to bring them up to speed to where civil society is, so that we can actually enable that co-creation to happen.
Thank you. Another question we have is, at some point, could the presenters comment on the word program and what is bounded by that term? I ask only because I am sometimes taxed by trying to distinguish program meaning an event and program meaning an approach, philosophy, and events on the ground. I use program for the later, as idiosyncratic as that is.
Just a comment on program. The things about programs is that programs are owned by organizations. So governments design programs, they put budgets behind them. That's the gas in the tank, if you wish. And then they regulate programs. So programs are, for better or worse, at least partly associated with the power over, not power with, not power to, but power over. And it's a fact of life that programs and the resources are therefore associated with a degree of centralized decision making and so on. When we use programs perhaps in a more generic sense, then it is a suite of projects, it's a suite of activities that can be designed locally and can be operationalized locally, but it is important to make the distinction as to who owns the program, who guides the program, who orchestrates it, and who sets the priorities, who determines what's most important and what's vital and what's urgent.
Alrighty, thank you. So I am going to now pause for a few minutes for the Q&A session. I will now pass it on to Dr. Francesco on his presentation. And then if you have any questions for all three of the presenters, we can definitely take them at the end.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. For me, it's a pleasure to participate in this event with my colleagues David and Brendan O'Keefe. It's a pleasure. Thank you for your invitation, and I am very proud to be with all of you. I'm going to tell you about one governance experience in a rural and subcon area of Spain called Altiplano de Granada. It's a concrete experience of rural development, of rural governance in one area of the south of Spain. We were talking before about the leader approach. Try to explain in more detail. Leader is the most emblematic practice of rural development that is being based or recent theories on endogenous rural development. It comes from the frameworks, as you can see in the presentation, and in the English meaning is links between the rural economy and development action. It tries to be as if in a rural area to foster rural development. It's an approach, a method, a way to implement rural development. But as you can see, as you know, all the rural areas haven't got the same soil, the same ground. So I mean the same capacities, assets, abilities, and skill to make the ground we haven't found in the same way in all these territories. Leader approach has 7 main specificities, as Brandon said before, no? And one of them has very relate with the governance. bottom-up approach, local decision-making, and the configuration of local action groups. Local actors have to participate in decision-making in the elaboration of the strategy. Local stakeholders are invited to take the lead. Local action groups are integrated by entrepreneurs, public institutions, and associations of every area. These local action groups live and decide about the local strategy and development projects to implement in every respective rural area inside through along the European Union. Leader has a long history, about 30 years, and has negative and positive aspects. In a positive way, we can say that it has been a tool that fosters the practice of participatory development, the empowerment, and the decision-making by the community, democratizing rural development, and creating and promoting social innovation. But on the other hand, in a negative way, sometimes the participation has been more formal than real. With a top-down control, we have regulation and restriction from the European Union, from the national and regional institutions, and even favoring unequal development because the investment capacity, human and social capital are not similar, are not distributed in the same way in all the rural areas or in the European Union. In addition, it's a program with a very few amount of money. And as you know, rural areas, rural territories have a very hard problem, and it's very complicated to try to cure a cancer, no? To cure the cancer with a small aspirin. Let me introduce the rural area of the Altiplano de Granada. It is a very marginal and deep rural area with low incomes per capita and an aging population, and where the inhabitants tending to migrate to other urban and developed areas. It has about 50,000 inhabitants, 14 municipalities, and about 3,500 square kilometers. The association of the local action group of the Altiplano de Granada is grouped by several local and public institutions, entrepreneurs, and associations. The assembly is composed of a representative set of private and public actors, in which the public entities, mainly municipalities, not represent more than 49% of the voting right in the decision making in this association, this local development association. To elaborate the local development strategy for the period, for the programming period between 2016 and 2022, the local action group thought that the best strategy and philosophy will be the human development approach, having as main pillars the promotion of human and social capital. They celebrate several meetings, discussion groups, focus groups, and thematic sessions. 2 sessions for every topic: note, social articulation, labor market, tourism, emerging sectors, youth and gender meetings, being celebrated additionally 2 global meetings. In the process of the elaboration of the local development strategy, participated about 316 inhabitants, 44% of them women, and 56% men. having less than 35 years, the 25% of them, the representation by collective, administration, association, entrepreneurs was too highly balanced. Maybe it was reduced in number, but it was highly constructive. The draft of the process was the next one. Inside of every thematic session were detected the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and tricks of analysis in a first phase. In the second phase, to face this, it was added an I-theft analysis, improve, correct, explore, and face. All of them made in a participative way through focus group. 1,000 needs were described that were abbreviated in 52 prioritized needs. In this point, the participation process was closed here, in this moment, taking place the office work by technician, giving finally to 4 concrete and main objectives, 12 specific objectives, and about 25 action lines being validated again in a participative way in a general meeting. So finally, the main aims were directed to human and social capital, investing in people, attract talent, and improve the working and entrepreneurial skill of the inhabitant, and in the other hand, favoring participatory relationship, increasing the diversity and strength of the associative and cooperative entities. So, let me tell you some final reflection about this study case. Governance is a process of development with the population, in which all the collectives must participate. Top-down power relationship, excessive bureaucracy, and political interests are sometimes obstacles in the implementation of governance in rural development. In addition, the high passivity and disarticulation of rural inhabitants are another impediment to promote rural governance. The shown participation looks for the common interest of every territory. In other hand, territorial governance is supported by the leadership of local government, giving a space of participation and decision to local entrepreneurs, associations, and so on. Social capital is mobilized to foster rural development, contributing in this way to local decision-making, empowerment, and a higher level of local democracy. Participation process, we think in this case, have not been formal. On the contrary way, has been real and effective. If we look on the level and the intensity of participation, the empowerment and learning of local actors, the strategies adopted in a participative way, promoting local identity, social cohesion and territorial commitment, and when local visionaries share and assume the project. So, governance process is working in the right way. Yes, thank you very much. I'm very proud to participate in this webinar. Apologize for my horrible English, spoken English, and I'm very proud to share and try to contribute in this event.
Thank you, Dr. Francesco, for this great presentation. So we can have a few more questions just for a couple more minutes if anybody has questions. There were a few questions that popped up during the presentation again, so let's see here. How would speakers connect leader to principles of folk school movement in?
Yes.
Well, I start on that. I certainly won't attempt to answer it completely, but there's an element of a number of things that are common between the folk school movement and its antecedents, especially in Denmark and other parts of the world, and that relates to back to some of the comments that Brendan was making. It's the respect for community culture, and we might emphasize local democracy. We might emphasize other dimensions of the community, but if we understand and respect communities as integrated social systems that have places, they don't just occupy a space. They not only occupy a place, but they construct a place. They make up a place that has a name, that has stories, that has memories, that has traditions, that has sacred symbols, and a whole variety of other things. So it's almost the sanctity of place, or at least the importance of place, that brings together a commonality between the folk school movement and its histories, and place-based development, and the program and the policies that go with a leader. There's a respect for, and an understanding and a deference to people in their places, people in their territorial communities. And if you respect that, and if you act upon it, you're acting in a very, very different way than if you're acting from a head office in the middle of a city, or from the main desk of a ministry in a central government. It's a very different perspective, a different mindset, and it leads to treating people in different ways.
I think that folk school movement in Scandinavian countries, I don't know much more about this movement, but I know that leader approach is promoting the identity, the local identity of every rural area. No? Then it's a new, not new, sorry, it's a asset, a new resource that has to be valorized for the local action group. In fact, there are transnational cooperation projects, international networks among local action groups that trying to try to foster the identity, the different identities of every local every area in the European Union. So they try to valorize the identity as a different local asset in every rural area.
Thank you, Dr. Francesco and David. Another question we have is, does leader need to reboot as a philosophy rather than as a funding program or even as a mythology?
Unquestionably, yes. I think so, yes. It is delivering its programs. You know, we see that in Spain, we see it in Ireland, we see it in the other countries. But we need to look at the longer term legacy, and we need to look at the ways. It's interesting that in Ireland, the leader organisations, if I could call them that, are also delivering other programs in community development, in social inclusion, in environment, you know, and we need to promote a greater synergy between those various strands of local development as well. because nobody can do it. Nobody can do the integrated, the package, as well as the leader organizations that have been there for a number of years. So there's a piece to be done around taking stock of that, and I think celebrating it and publicizing it a bit more and bringing some hope and some affirmation to those who are at the coalface in rural and community development generally. I think we need to be, to put a greater value. Francisco spoke about valorization of assets, but there's also the valorization of the approach. And I think that's what needs to happen.
Yes, leader right now is working as a philosophy. In every rural development program, in every region of the European Union, some measures that some action lines try to implement these lines with the leader approach. It's a methodology. It's a way to act, no? It's a way to implement the program, the rural development program, and in every regional area of territory, in the European Union.
One more question is, how do you deal with real power differentials?
I don't see anybody starting on that, so once again, I'll get my oar in the water. Part of the response to that challenge, power differentials, I think, is first of all to acknowledge them. Sometimes the rhetoric of politics, the rhetoric of the market, the rhetoric of other sources of power tells us or tries to persuade us that if we get enough money, if we get enough education, if we live in the right part of the village or the right part of the city or whatever it might be, we will reduce power differentials, and we will equalize things, or we will overcome things. And to a large extent, mass consumerism of the market depends on that fiction. So I think the start of dealing with power differentials is to first of all acknowledge them. And it's not an unusual exercise in community development for a group of community residents to sit down together and to get out pencil and paper or paint on cardboard or whatever they want to work with, and to do what we call power mapping. And that is to map the power centers in the community and then to connect them and to understand where the power is and who's exercising the power. And then to make a distinction between the different types of power. Earlier on, I alluded to power over. And very often, rural communities are subjugated through central governments, through international investment protocols, and through other sources of power. And they are subjugated because somebody has power over them. And what we try to do in community development is to identify the distribution of different types of power, to hold a conversation about that, and then to decide on whether it is important enough to shift the center of gravity of the power in the community. And that takes us into community development. So part of it, as I say, is to acknowledge it. Part of it is to understand it. Part of it is to share our understandings. This is what Paulo Freire, the Brazilian well-known developer, would have emphasized, to understand the nature and the distribution of power and the centers of power, and then to, having mapped it, to decide on whether we need a shift in the distribution of power and shift in the nature of power to move our community towards the type of development that we think is desirable. So that, I think, is the start of the response. it's by no means a full response to that very important question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, David. So we'll just take one last question, and that is, does central government funding get in the way of local area development?
Central government funding is necessary. I mean, take the word rural out of that question and put in urban, and all of a sudden the question is deflated. You know, citizens in rural areas pay their taxes. They're entitled to a level of service provision as well. Okay, it's different to what you would expect in an urban context, or where you have a so-called critical mass of people. But rural people are entitled to a level of funding, a level of service from the state. That's the social contract between the citizen and the state. So that needs to apply in the rural development context as well. The challenge, of course, is to deal with the power differential that's caused by the funder calling all of the shots and not recognizing the contributions that come from the other actors who are putting expertise, time, usually voluntary time, putting so much of themselves into the process as well. It's very easy for the state to provide the funding. Sometimes it can be more of an effort for the other partners to bring something to the table. So all contributions are important.
Thank you. Thank you for answering all those questions for our audience. Do you guys have any last minute things to add or say? Any of the presenters?
Not at this stage. My thanks to the webinar participants. It's been very informative and very enjoyable to collaborate.
I second that.
Okay. I would like to once again thank you, Dr. Brandon, David, and Dr. Francesco, for your great presentation and for sharing that information with us. It was very informative. I would also like to thank the audience for attending this webinar and for their participation. Have a great day, everybody, and thank you for participating.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you very much.